The Collaboration Chapter 6 Switched On, Part 2. While Paramount was making these kinds of proclamations and doing business with Germany, Jack Warner was campaigning in the opposite direction. He met with Franklin D. Roosevelt, who, somewhat surprisingly, brought up Chaplin's abandonment of the Hitler picture. Roosevelt said that he hoped the picture might still come to fruition. Warner was, of course, delighted to hear Roosevelt's opinion on this matter, and he wrote to Chaplin immediately. I assured the president you had not planned to drop the making of it. I remember your telling me you were going ahead with it, and I hope you do, Charlie, for if the president of our country is interested in your making the picture, it certainly has merit. Upon receiving this letter, Chaplin issued an official statement in which he denied that he was ever considering canceling the project. He was going ahead with it, and he was not worried about intimidation, censorship, or anything else. The only problem was that he was a perfectionist, and he would need more than a year and a half to complete the film. Warner Brothers was not alone in its efforts, but its schedule was a lot tighter than Chaplin's, and it would eventually be credited as the first major studio to break the peace with Hitler. The idea for its spy picture came from one of the most sensational stories to hit American newspapers in the previous year. From May 1936 to February 1938, a U.S. Army deserter named Gunther Rumrich had carried out research for the Abwehr, that's the German military intelligence agency, from his home in New York City. He had managed to purchase the Z code, the signal used by the U.S. Army for transmitting messages from ship to shore, and then he had been caught in an attempt to obtain 50 blank passports and the Army mobilization plans for the Eastern Seaboard. His subsequent interrogation by a special agent in the FBI, Leon G. Thureau, had led to the arrest of a Nazi spy network operating in the United States. On June 20th, 1938, the day that 18 individuals were indicted by a New York grand jury for espionage, Thureau resigned from the just the FBI. And 3 days later, he sold the film rights to his story. He sold the film rights to his story to Warner Brothers. The studio began working on a script, and when the trial concluded at the end of the year, a copy was sent to Hay's office for inspection. Not surprisingly, Joseph Breen was very concerned. He had read the letter of protest from Paramount, and he understood that a controversial picture by Warner Brothers might endanger the business of other studios still selling movies in Germany. Nevertheless, after going through the script, he was forced to admit that the picture was technically within the provisions of the production code. It represented Germany honestly and fairly, because it told the story of espionage that had not only been verified in a court of law, but was also common knowledge throughout the United States. Furthermore, Warner Brothers had been promised indirect, if not direct, aid, assistance, and cooperation from certain important government officials. With its relatively little fuss, Breen issued a certificate of approval for the project now entitled Confessions of a Nazi Spy. The actual production of the picture, which began February 1st, 1939, did not proceed quite as smoothly. Warner Brothers was forced to print only a limited number of scripts because George Gisling and the German-American Bund were desperately trying to get their hands on it. The regular studio workers received threatening phone calls, and several actors and producers received death threats. When the filming began, security guards were hired to prevent unauthorized people from entering the soundstage. The studio at least benefited by sending photographs of the security measures to the press for publicity purposes. After only 6 weeks of production, Warner Brothers had completed the first major anti-Nazi film. The names of the characters had been changed, but in every other respect, Confessions of a Nazi Spy turned out to be a remarkably faithful account of the events that had taken place in New York. The film also pulled no punches, depicting all Nazis, whether spies or members of the German-American Bund, as radical fanatics who took their orders directly from Berlin. American citizens were urged to be extremely vigilant and to stand up against this evil menace that threatened the democratic form of government. Confessions of a Nazi Spy was released May 6, 1939, and the Nazis and their sympathizers reacted dramatically. Theaters were vandalized. Critics in the Midwest were urged to write negative reviews, and Hollywood was denounced as a Jewish conspiracy. The German-American Bund sought an injunction against the film and sued the Warner Brothers for slander. Hans Thomsen, acting chief of the German embassy in Washington, D.C., submitted an official complaint to the State Department, and the German Foreign Office managed to have the picture banned in over 20 countries around the world. Despite all the drama and secrecy, however, Confessions of a Nazi Spy was by no means a great film. Warner Brothers claimed to have spent over $1.5 million on it, but the actual figure was close to $656,000. Confessions of a Nazi Spy was an obvious B picture with exaggerated German characters, a cheesy narrator, and a simple-minded script. Unlike the abandoned productions of the past, it did not broach important subjects such as the persecution of Jews, such as The Mad Dog of Europe and Personal History showed, or the fascist tendencies in American life, such as It Can't Happen Here. It was just a formulaic spy story with the Nazis playing the role of villains. Many reviewers picked up on the cheapness of the production and wished that Warner Brothers had pitched its battles on a higher plane. Hitler won't like it, neither will Goebbels, the New York Times commented. Frankly, we were not too favorably impressed either. The New York Times was wrong about one detail. A copy of the film eventually ended up in the hands of the propaganda ministry, and one night, Goebbels actually watched it. 35 minutes into the film, he saw a fictional version of himself appear on the screen. The character was giving instructions to the head of the German-American Bund on how to spread Nazi propaganda in the United States. There is to be a slight change in our methods. From now on, National Socialism of the United States must dress itself in the American flag. It must appear to be the defense of Americanism. But at the same time, our aim must always be to discredit conditions there in the United States, and in this way make life in Germany admired and wished for. In the ensuing chaos, we will be able to take control. Goebbels was overwhelmed to see himself in a Hollywood movie. His fictional counterpart had made just a 2-minute appearance, but Goebbels could not help exaggerating the part in his diary. I myself play a main role, and not even a particularly unpleasant one, he wrote. But I do not consider the film dangerous otherwise. It arouses fear in our enemies rather than anger and hate. Even Goebbels had recognized that Confessions of a Nazi Spy was nothing to get worked up about. The unfortunate truth for Warner Brothers was that the production had not lived up to the controversy that surrounded it. The reviews were, of course, dramatic. Hollywood declares war on the Nazis, was the typical headline. This film starts the war. But the world remained at peace after Warner Brothers released Confessions of a Nazi Spy, and the other American studios did not even notice any great change in business conditions in Germany. If anything, their situation slightly improved. German exhibitors indicated that American pictures were still needed, and Goebbels himself was having second thoughts about Hitler's new policy. Should we really suppress American films? He asked himself. I myself am not all that certain. Under these circumstances, the 3 remaining studios managed to continue with their regular business activities. They kept selling their movies in Germany, and they did not engage in any attacks on the Nazis. An executive at 20th Century Fox, Walter J. Hutchinson, was asked whether the companies were pulling out, and he replied, I have never heard of such a thing. We'll stick in Germany as long as we can do business there. An executive at Paramount agreed. It is only logical for us to do business whatever profitable, as an obligation to our stockholders. The official attitude of the biggest studio at the time, too. MGM will make pictures without regard to politics and will only box office and entertainment in mind. And so, in the summer of 1939, Hollywood movies were still playing to packed theaters throughout Germany. In July and August alone, 5 new American features premiered in Berlin. Then on September 1st, something happened that was much more significant than the release of a picture like Confessions of a Nazi Spy. German troops marched unannounced into Poland, and the Second World War began. Within a few weeks, Britain, France, and the USSR were all embroiled in the conflict. The United States remained neutral, however, and the propaganda ministry was determined that American movies should play unhindered in Germany as long as this was the case. Will Hayes did his part by issuing a statement on behalf of American film industry. There will be no cycle of hate pictures. The primary purpose of motion pictures is entertainment. The system of collaboration therefore remained in place. The American studios continued to pander to the whims of the Nazi regime in a variety of ways. MGM, which was already financing the productions of German armaments, now donated 11 of its most popular films, including After the Thin Man and Viva Villa, to the German government to help with the war relief effort. For the most part, American movies were well received in Germany in this period. 3 MGM musicals were hugely successful. Rose-Marie played for 42 days in Berlin, Broadway's Serenade for 56 days, and Honolulu for 69 nice days. And in October 1939, just when the first newsreels of the successful campaign against Poland were hitting the screens in Germany, a Clark Gable film called Too Hot to Handle, which spoofed the newsreel business in America, was at the beginning of a 35-day run. Audiences first applauded the German army during the actual newsreel footage, and then watched what they perceived to be the sequel. A great plot involving a newsreel reporter, a kind of swindler with a big heart, in the South American wilderness. And such irresistibly crazy things happened that by the end, the audience in the Marmor House, I assume that's a theater, the audience in the Marmor House could not stop laughing. As the war continued, however, serious doubts started entering the minds of the studio executives in Hollywood. Although a few of their films were still being shown in Germany, the hostilities were drastically reducing their much more significant business in England and France. This was a devastating development. 20th Century Fox estimated its average weekly income for European countries before the war was as follows. England, 200,000. France, 50,000. Germany, between 28 and 30,000. With the loss of most of this income, the studio executives were forced to take desperate measures. At 20th Century Fox, MGM, Paramount, and Warner Brothers, hundreds of employees were dismissed. At Columbia Pictures, Harry and Jack Kahn took voluntary pay cuts of 33%, and various producers and advisory staff across the board took cuts ranging from 10 to 50%. Soon the heads of the studio were reconsidering their options. They started to think in terms similar to those laid out by William C. DeMille, the brother of the director. 1 year earlier, by killing the sale of American films in most of Europe, Mr. Hitler, aided by the leaders of various other totalitarian states, have finally removed that chance of commercial gain, which lies so close to the heart of international politeness. With all hope of profit gone, we can, at last, become properly indignant and raise our voices in shocked protest without any pecuniary regrets. DeMille had made this statement prematurely, back when Warner Brothers were working on Confessions of a Nazi Spy. His words were much more relevant now. Hitler had cut Hollywood's foreign revenue by around half, not by prohibiting American movies, but by initiating a war that was impacting European distribution, and the heads of the studios were having a change of heart. As the war raged in Europe, a commercially viable idea was starting to take shape in their minds. Of course, there was nothing they could do about the situation in Europe. They were forced to accept that their markets had been severely damaged. But the Second World War was at least promising in one respect. It provided a terrific subject for future productions, and while the studio heads had avoided criticizing the Nazis in peacetime out of concern for the German market, they now had on their hands a topic so promising that the German market was starting to seem insignificant by comparison. They still had no intention of leaving Germany, though. They simply changed their priorities. In the words of one reporter, ideas were creeping their way into production agenda, despite the cries of reactionary critics whose contention has been the sole content of the motion picture should be escapist entertainment. The change took place gradually. In early 1940, 2 of the studios still doing business in Germany, 20th Century Fox and MGM, embarked on their first anti-Nazi films. The studio heads, who were breaking a policy that had been in place for nearly a decade, made sure to supervise every aspect of the production process. When Darryl Zanuck read an early draft of 20th Century Fox, a first anti-Nazi film, Four Sons, for example, he assembled his writers and announced his reaction. Generally speaking, Mr. Zanuck likes very much the way Mr. Lawson has handled the story. However, there is one major mistake we must rectify, and that is, our personal story has been submerged to give prominence to the march of events. It must be the other way around. Mr. Zanuck mentioned Nazi Spy as a case in point, where the story concerned itself with a problem, and therefore the entertainment values suffered and the picture was not a success. Zanuck continued, Hitler's name should be only mentioned once, in the early part of the story. When someone asks what it's all about, or whatever it is, he is told, oh, there's some fellow by the name of Hitler who's doing so-and-so, and from then on, Hitler's name should be kept out of it, although we do everything in connection with the Nazi activities just as you do it now. Four Sons was a relatively minor film set in Czechoslovakia that ignored the specific dangers of Nazism. It greatly annoyed George Gisling, who began raising the roof with the studio, but it made very little impact on anyone else. In the meantime, however, a much more important film was underway at MGM. A few executives at the studio were finally being forced to confront a subject that they had been avoiding ever since Hitler came to power in Germany. The idea for the film was first suggested by an obscure MGM employee who had read Phyllis Bottom's best-selling novel, The Mortal Storm, which had been published in the United States in 1938. This employee had been deeply moved by the story and had sent a persuasive memorandum to the studio's production department. This is not a book of propaganda, but a fair picture of the situation in Nazi Germany. If a picture is made on this controversial subject, this book is recommended for aside from the politics involved. It is a great story. MGM quickly purchased the rights for the film of Mortal Storm, and four writers, Anderson Ellis, George Froschel, John Golder, and Claudine West, set about adapting it for the screen. They worked hard to convey the novel's central conception of a German family torn apart by the rise of Nazism. Here was the structure that they came up with. On January 30th, 1933, in a small university town in Germany, a happy family was sitting down to dinner. The family consisted of Professor Roth, a famous Jewish scientist, Amelia Roth, his non-Jewish wife, Freya and Rudy, their children, and two sons from Amelia's previous marriage named Otto and Erich von Rohn. As they were enjoying their meal, one of the servants burst into the room and announced that Adolf Hitler had been named Chancellor of Germany. Then everything disintegrated. Otto and Erich became ardent Nazis and joined the SA. Professor Roth was taken to a concentration camp where he died under mysterious circumstances. His wife escaped to Austria with Rudy, and his daughter was killed in an attempt to escape at the end. This dramatic storyline represented a radical departure from Hollywood's previous policy towards Nazi Germany. Ever since 1933, the various studios had vowed neither to attack the Nazis nor to defend the Jews in their film. With the sudden loss of revenue in Europe, the studios had just started to rethink the first side of their policy. Now they were being forced to rethink the second. The script from The Mortal Storm brought a Jewish character back into American cinema in dramatic fashion. And in one particular scene, taken straight from the book, it did even more. The scene began this way. One afternoon, Rudy came home from school and told his mother and sister that he had been having problems with his friends. One boy had refused to sit next to him in the classroom, and a few others had thrown stones at him. At the end of the day, the headmaster had given him a form for his father to fill out. The form was headed, Proof of Aryan Descent, and it ended with the question, Percentage of Jewish blood. His sister quickly understood what was going on. Just a few days earlier, she had used a strange term to describe her father. Non-Aryan, and now she was starting to see that term applied to her and Rudy too. She said nothing, so Rudy decided to bring up the matter with his father. I'm not a Jew, am I, father? Rudy asked. Mother isn't, nor Otto or Erich. You're right. They're not, Professor Roth answered. But Rudy, I am. I don't know, father, Rudy said impatiently. But it doesn't make any difference to me, does it? It does, Rudy. Since the new government came into power, it's no longer a question of faith. It's a radical question. What does that mean? It means that no matter what your religion may be, if you have a certain percentage of Jewish blood, the government considers you of Jewish race. You mean I am Jewish? From their standpoint, yes. A look of dread appeared on Rudy's face. Professor Roth understood that what Rudy was going through and decided to tell his son about his heritage. I'm proud to be a Jew, he said. I'm proud to belong to the race that gave Europe its religion and its moral law, much of its science, too, much of its genius in art, literature, and music. Mendelssohn was a Jew, and Rubinstein, the great English statesman. Disraeli was a Jew, and so was our poet Heine, who wrote Lorelei. But Rudy was not convinced, and he begged, "Father, do we have to put it on the form?" Professor Roth looked at his son sympathetically. "Things are not going to be easy for you, son," he replied. "But to know you're right is half the battle. Our race has outlived persecution. God willing, we shall survive the injustice and cruelty of these bewildering days. When you're caught in a storm, you must bow to it, but you mustn't be ashamed or afraid." There was a brief silence. Then Rudy lifted his head and said, "I'm not afraid now." "I know I can rely on you and be proud of you," Professor Roth said. "You have gifts and qualities of my people. Be true to them." Now first the name, Rudolf Erich Roth. Then, according to the script, he starts to write. The camera goes to a close shot of Rudy. He looks out into the bleak future, first with bewilderment, then with tightening lips and defiant eyes as we fade out. In early February 1940, just before The Mortal Storm went into production, a version of the script was sent to Phyllis Batome, who had written the novel. Batome was extremely impressed with what she had heard. But she had a few concerns, so she wrote to the producer, who was Sidney Franklin. "I would not put in Frey's mouth the word non-Aryan instead of Jew. In the early days of the Hitler regime, when the story takes place, the word Jew was always used by proud and self-respecting Jews of themselves. Freya would have flung up her head and said with pride, 'My father is a Jew.'" Next, Batome turned to the father-son scene. "Rudy is a German boy," she said, "and it is a pity not to show him from the first, as far more proud of his father and loyal to him than anxious to escape his Jewish heritage. He would never have begged to not be a Jew." Batome emphasized that this question of Jewish pride was the crux of the book and the crux of the world today. Meanwhile, following normal practice, MGM sent every new copy of the script to the Hays office for inspection. Joseph Breen read a total of 16 scripts over 8 months, including 13 scripts within the film, while the film was in production. In this period, Breen did not hear a word of protest from the German consul. Nor did he write to the studio with any objections of his own. He simply approved a picture in which the main character had expressed his pride in being a Jew. End of Part 6.